Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. In the heart of South Carolina's low country, where ancient oak trees draped in moss create tunnels of shade over winding roads, and where the water meets the land in a maze of tidal marshes and rivers, there existed a legacy that seemed untouchable. For nearly a century, one name dominated the legal landscape of Hampton County and the surrounding region. That name was Murdaugh. It carried weight in courtrooms, commanded respect in the community, and inspired both admiration and fear in equal measure. The Murdaugh family weren't just lawyers. They were an institution, a dynasty, a force that had shaped the very fabric of justice in their corner of the South for 3 generations. The family's influence began with Randolph Murdaugh Sr., who became the solicitor for South Carolina's 14th Judicial Circuit in 1920. In this role, he served as the chief prosecutor for 5 counties, wielding enormous power over which cases went to trial and how justice was administered. When he retired in 1940, his son Randolph Murdaugh Jr. took over the position, and when Randolph Jr. stepped down in 1986, his son Randolph Murdaugh III assumed the role. For 87 consecutive years, Murdaugh held the office of solicitor, prosecuting cases, sending people to prison, and building a reputation that would become synonymous with law and order in the region. But the family's influence extended far beyond the solicitor's office. The Murdaughs also ran a prestigious law firm, Peters, Murdaugh, Parker, Eltsroth, and Detrick, commonly known as PMT. The firm specialized in personal injury cases, and the Murdaughs became legendary for their ability to win massive settlements for their clients. They were known as fierce advocates, brilliant strategists, and some whispered, ruthless in their pursuit of victory. In Hampton County, a rural area where poverty was common and opportunities were scarce, the Murdaughs represented power and prosperity. They owned substantial property, including a sprawling hunting lodge called Moselle, and they lived lives of privilege that set them apart from most of their neighbors. Yet despite their wealth and status, the Murdaughs cultivated an image of being men of the people. They attended local churches, sponsored community events, and maintained deep ties to the area where their roots ran generations deep. They were seen at high school football games, at fish fries, at charity functions. Randolph Murdaugh, known to everyone as Buster, was particularly beloved. He had a commanding presence in the courtroom and a warm, folksy demeanor outside of it. When he spoke, people listened. When he walked into a room, conversations shifted. The Murdaugh name meant something in the Low Country, something powerful and seemingly permanent. By the early 21st century, the torch had passed to the 4th generation. Randolph Murdaugh IV, known as Alex, was born in 1968 and seemed destined to continue the family tradition. He attended college at the University of South Carolina, then earned his law degree from the same institution in 1994. He joined PMPD and quickly established himself as a skilled litigator, particularly in wrongful death and personal injury cases. Alex had inherited his family's charisma and courtroom prowess. He could connect with juries, tell compelling stories, and secure verdicts that sometimes reached into the millions of dollars. He became a partner at the firm and seemed poised to perhaps one day become solicitor himself, extending the Murdaugh dynasty even further into the future. Alex married Margaret Kennedy Branch, known to everyone as Maggie, in 1993. Maggie came from a well-respected family herself. She was beautiful, warm, and devoted to her family. Friends described her as the kind of person who lit up a room, who made everyone feel welcome, who had a gift for bringing people together. She was active in her community, involved in her children's lives, and deeply in love with Alex. Together, they seemed to embody the perfect Southern couple, gracious and successful, with everything to look forward to. The couple had 2 sons. Their firstborn, Richard Alexander Murdaugh Jr., was called Buster, named after his grandfather. Born in 1996, Buster was a bright, athletic young man who attended Wofford College and then the University of South Carolina School of Law. Following in the footsteps of his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, he was quieter than his father, more reserved, but he carried himself with the confidence that came from being a Murdaugh. Their younger son, Paul Terry Murdaugh, was born in 1999. Paul was different from his older brother. Where Buster was measured and controlled, Paul was impulsive and outgoing. He was loud, boisterous, fun-loving, and fiercely loyal to his friends. He loved hunting, fishing, and spending time at Moselle, the family's sprawling property in Colleton County. The estate covered 1,700 acres of fields, forests, and waterfront along the Salcatchie River. It was a paradise for outdoor enthusiasts, with deer stands, duck blinds, and trails winding through the wilderness. For Paul, Moselle was more than just a piece of property. It was a sanctuary, a place where he felt most himself, where the pressures and expectations that came with his last name could fade away, if only temporarily. The Murdaugh family seemed to have it all. Wealth, influence, respect. A legacy that stretched back a century. They lived in a beautiful home in Hampton, spent weekends at Moselle, took vacations on the coast, and moved through their world with the ease and confidence of people who had never known what it meant to be powerless. But beneath the surface of this perfect image, cracks were beginning to form. Small fractures at first, barely noticeable to those on the outside, but deep enough that they would eventually bring the entire structure crashing down. Paul Murdaugh's life took a dark turn in the early hours of February 24, 2019. He was 19 years old, home from college for the weekend, and out with friends on a boat owned by his family. It was a beautiful night, unseasonably warm for late February, and a group of 6 young people had decided to go oyster roasting on Pocky Island, a small barrier island near Beaufort. The group included Paul's girlfriend, Morgan Doughty, his longtime friend Anthony Cook, Anthony's girlfriend Mallory Beach, and Connor Cook and Molly Altman, another couple in their social circle. They set out from a dock near Beaufort in the Murdaugh family's Sea Hunt boat, a center console vessel powered by a strong outboard motor. The plan was simple: head out to the island, roast oysters over a fire, enjoy the night air and each other's company, then return home. But the evening quickly spiraled out of control. According to later testimony, Paul began drinking heavily early in the night. His friends would later describe a dramatic change in his personality when he drank. They said he became aggressive, belligerent, and sometimes violent. They even had a nickname for this altered version of Paul: Timmy. When Paul was himself, he was fun and loyal. When Timmy emerged, he was someone else entirely, someone his friends feared. The group stopped at a waterfront oyster bar called Luther's Rare and Well Done before heading to the island. Surveillance footage and witness statements would later confirm that Paul continued drinking there, becoming increasingly intoxicated and unsteady. His girlfriend Morgan tried to get him to slow down, but Paul ignored her. When the group finally left Luther's and headed toward Pocky Island, tensions were running high. Paul insisted on driving the boat despite his obvious impairment. His friends pleaded with him to let someone else take the wheel, but Paul refused. He was belligerent, combative, and according to witness statements, he physically pushed Connor Cook away when Connor tried to take control of the boat. The return trip from the island turned into a nightmare. Paul was driving the boat erratically, speeding through unfamiliar channels in the dark, ignoring the navigation markers and the pleas of his terrified friends. The boat was traveling at high speed through Archer's Creek, a narrow waterway surrounded by marsh grass and oyster beds, when disaster struck. At approximately 2:20 in the morning, the boat slammed into the piling of a bridge at full speed. The impact was devastating. The sound of fiberglass crunching against concrete echoed across the water. Bodies were thrown in every direction. When the boat finally came to rest, 5 of the 6 passengers were still aboard, injured and disoriented, some bleeding, all in shock. But one person was missing: Mallory Beach, 19 years old. A beautiful young woman with her whole life ahead of her, had been thrown from the boat upon impact. She had vanished into the cold, dark water. The search began immediately. Emergency responders arrived at the scene within minutes, but finding someone in the water at night, in an area with strong currents and limited visibility, was nearly impossible. The Coast Guard was called in. Dive teams were deployed. Helicopters with searchlights swept the area. Friends and family gathered on the shore, watching, waiting, praying. As the hours passed with no sign of Mallory, hope began to fade. The water temperature was in the low 50s, cold enough to cause hypothermia in less than an hour. Even if she had survived the impact, even if she had surfaced somewhere in the darkness, the odds of survival diminished with each passing minute. The search continued for days. Law enforcement officials combed the waterways, checking every inlet, every marsh, every piece of shoreline. Volunteers joined the effort, hundreds of people from the community who wanted to help, who couldn't bear the thought of Mallory being out there somewhere, alone in the water. Her parents, Philip and Renee Beach, were devastated, clinging to the hope that somehow and possibly, their daughter would be found alive. But as the days stretched into a week, the reality became inescapable. Mallory was gone. Her body was finally discovered on March 3, 2019. More than a week after the crash, she was found in the marsh several miles from the crash site, where the currents had carried her. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma and drowning. She had died on impact or shortly after, her young life cut short in an instant of violence and chaos. The community mourned. Mallory had been a beloved figure, known for her kindness, her bright smile, and her dreams of becoming a nurse. She had just started college. She had a boyfriend who loved her, parents who adored her, friends who cherished her. And now she was gone. Her death a senseless tragedy that never should have happened. In the immediate aftermath of the crash, something strange occurred. The investigation into who had been driving the boat became murky and confused. The surviving passengers gave conflicting statements. Some said Paul had been driving. Others seemed uncertain or changed their stories. There were reports that at the scene of the crash, before law enforcement arrived, there had been discussions among the passengers about what to say. About protecting Paul, about protecting the Murdaugh name. Connor Cook would later claim that he felt pressured to take the blame for the crash, that there was an attempt to pin the responsibility on him rather than on Paul. The Murdaugh family's influence seemed to extend into the investigation itself. Alex Murdaugh arrived at the hospital where the injured passengers had been taken, and according to witnesses, he immediately began trying to control the narrative. He spoke to the young people involved, he spoke to law enforcement officers, and he made phone calls to people in positions of power. Some witnesses reported feeling intimidated, feeling that they couldn't tell the truth about what had happened without facing consequences from the most powerful family in the region. But despite the confusion and the alleged attempts at manipulation, the evidence was clear. Paul Murdaugh had been driving the boat, he had been intoxicated, and his recklessness had resulted in Mallory Beach's death. In April 2019, Paul was indicted on 3 felony counts boating under the influence causing death, and 2 counts of boating under the influence causing great bodily injury. If convicted, he faced up to 25 years in prison. For the first time in the Murdaugh family's long history, one of their own was facing serious criminal charges. The dynasty that had spent a century prosecuting others was now on the defensive, and the community watched with a mixture of fascination and horror as the case slowly moved through the legal system. But the boat crash was only the beginning of the Murdaugh family's troubles. What no one knew at the time was that beneath the surface of Alex Murdaugh's successful life, a web of deception, theft, and betrayal was spreading. Financial problems that Alex had managed to hide for years were growing more severe. Debts were mounting. Questions were being asked. And the pressure was building to a point where something had to give. The Murdaugh family tried to maintain normalcy in the months following Paul's indictment. They continued to live at their home in Hampton, continued to spend time at Moselle, continued to present a united front to the community. But the strain was evident. Paul was particularly affected by the charges hanging over him. He was vilified in the media, blamed for Mallory's death, and faced the very real possibility of spending years in prison. His mental health suffered. He began drinking more heavily. His relationship with his girlfriend Morgan ended. He withdrew from some of his friends and clung more tightly to his family, particularly to his mother Maggie, who stood by him unwaveringly. Alex threw himself into defending his son. He hired powerful attorneys. He worked behind the scenes to delay the trial, to challenge the evidence, to do whatever he could protect Paul from the consequences of his actions. The upcoming trial was scheduled for summer 2021, And as that date approached, the pressure on the family intensified. The Beach family had filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Murdaughs, seeking damages for Mallory's death. The lawsuit threatened not just Paul, but the entire family's financial empire. Discovery in the civil case had the potential to expose financial information that Alex had worked hard to keep hidden. The walls were closing in. Maggie Murdaugh, throughout all of this turmoil, remained a steady presence. She supported Paul through his legal troubles. She maintained the household. She tried to hold her family together as the pressure mounted from all sides. Friends described her as resilient, devoted, and unfailingly loyal to her husband and sons. She loved spending time at Moselle, finding peace in the natural beauty of the property, in the simple pleasures of country life away from the scrutiny and gossip of town. She had no way of knowing that Moselle, the place she found most peaceful, would become the site of unimaginable horror. The evening of June 7, 2021, began like many others at Moselle. It was a Monday, warm and humid as June evenings in South Carolina tend to be. The sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields and forests of the property. Maggie had spent much of the day away from Moselle, but she returned that evening. Paul was at the property as well, spending time near the kennels where the family kept their hunting dogs. The kennels were located several hundred yards from the main house, down a long dirt road that wound through trees. It was a peaceful spot surrounded by woods, the kind of place where you could hear birds singing and leaves rustling and not much else. Alex Murdaugh would later say that he had been visiting his mother, who lived nearby and was in failing health. He claimed he had left Moselle in the late afternoon and hadn't returned until later that evening. But phone records, video evidence, and forensic analysis would later paint a very different picture of what actually happened that night. At some point that evening, Maggie and Paul were together near the kennels. Paul took a video on his phone at 8:44 p.m., a short clip showing one of the family's dogs. The video was mundane, the kind of thing people record dozens of times a day without thinking about it. But this particular video would become crucial evidence, because it proved beyond any doubt that both Maggie and Paul were alive at that specific time. And it captured audio that would later be analyzed and scrutinized by investigators and experts. Minutes after that video was recorded, something terrible happened. Someone approached the kennels carrying a gun, actually two guns, a rifle and a shotgun. What happened next was swift, brutal, and devastating. Paul Murdaugh was shot first. The shotgun blast struck him in the chest and shoulder at close range, the impact so powerful that it nearly tore his arm from his body. He would have fallen immediately, his life ending in an instant of violence and pain. But the shooter wasn't finished. A second shot was fired into Paul as he lay on the ground, this one to the head, ensuring that he was dead. Maggie likely heard the shots. She may have screamed. She almost certainly tried to run. But she didn't make it far, and the shooter first time the weapon was different, a rifle, possibly a .300 Blackout, a weapon designed for accuracy and killing power. The first bullet struck Maggie as she fled, hitting her in the leg or torso. She fell. And as she lay there, wounded and terrified, the shooter stood over her and fired again. And again. Maggie Murdaugh was shot multiple times, the bullets tearing through her body, ending her life in a barrage of violence that seemed designed not just to kill, but to obliterate. When the shooting stopped, the scene near the kennels was one of unspeakable carnage. Paul's body lay near the entrance to a storage shed, his injuries so severe that identification would later require fingerprints. Maggie's body was sprawled several yards away, her blood pooling on the ground, her phone lying nearby. The two guns used in the murders were nowhere to be found. The killer had taken them, or hidden them, leaving behind only the brass casings and the bodies of a mother and son who had been alive and breathing just minutes before. The property was silent again. The dogs in the kennels, if they had barked during the shooting, were quiet now. The evening sounds of the low country resumed, insects, buzzing, frogs calling from the nearby creek, the wind moving through the pine trees. But the peace of Moselle had been shattered forever. 2 lives had been taken in a burst of violence that lasted less than a minute. and the questions that would arise from those murders would consume investigators, the media, and the public for years to come. At 10:07 p.m., a 911 call was placed from Moselle. The caller was Alex Murdaugh, and his voice on the recording was frantic, desperate, broken. He told the dispatcher that he had just arrived home and found his wife and son dead near the kennels. He said he didn't know what had happened, that he had been gone and come back to find them shot. His words tumbled over each other, his breathing was rapid, and he sounded like a man in the grip of absolute shock and devastation. The dispatcher tried to calm him, tried to get clear information about the situation, but Alex was nearly incoherent. He kept repeating that they were dead, that someone had killed them, that he didn't know who or why. He said he had checked their bodies, that there was nothing he could do, that they were gone. The call lasted several minutes, with Alex growing increasingly agitated, demanding that law enforcement hurry, begging for help, and it was far too late for help to do any good. First responders arrived at Moselle within minutes of the call. They found Alex Murdaugh outside the kennels, near the bodies of his wife and son. He was covered in blood, though he claimed it was from checking their bodies, from touching them, from trying futilely to see if they could be saved. The officers secured the scene, called for backup, and began the grim work of processing what was clearly a double homicide. The scene was chaotic. More law enforcement arrived, including officers from the Colleton County Sheriff's Office and agents from the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, known as SLUD. Crime scene tape was strung up around the kennels. Floodlights were brought in to illuminate the area as darkness fell completely. Photographers documented every angle of the scene. Evidence markers were placed beside shell casings. The bodies of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh remained where they had fallen, awaiting the arrival of the coroner. Alex was taken away from the immediate crime scene, but he remained on the property, giving initial statements to investigators. He was distraught, weeping openly, his hands shaking. He told the officers that he had been at his mother's house in nearby Almeda, that he had returned to Moselle to find the front door open and no one answering when he called out. He said he had driven down to the kennels, perhaps thinking Maggie and Paul were there with the dogs, and that's when he discovered their bodies. He said he had no idea who could have done this. He mentioned that Paul had received threats because of the boat crash case, that there were people who blamed him for Mallory Beach's death, people who might want revenge. But he couldn't name anyone specific, couldn't point investigators toward any concrete suspect or motive. He just kept repeating that his family was dead, that someone had murdered his wife and son, and that he wanted whoever did it found and brought to justice. As the night wore on and the investigation at Moselle continued, word of the murders began to spread through Hampton County and beyond. The Murdaugh name was too well known, the family too prominent, for the news to stay contained for long. By morning, reporters were gathering outside the property, cameras were rolling, and the story was making headlines across South Carolina, and then across the nation. The Murdaugh dynasty, already tarnished by Paul's boat crash charges, was now at the center of an even darker story. The community was stunned. People who had known the Murdaughs for years, who had seen them at church and school functions and around town, couldn't process what had happened. Maggie and Paul, murdered at their own home, killed in a burst of violence that seemed to come from nowhere. The theories began immediately. Some thought it must have been someone seeking revenge for Mallory Beach's death, someone who blamed Paul and decided to take justice into their own hands. Others whispered about drug dealers or criminals that the Murdaughs had prosecuted over the years, people who might have held grudges and finally acted on them. And some, though they were quieter about it, wondered if the answer might be closer to home. The investigation moved forward with unusual intensity. SLEG took the lead, recognizing that this was a case that demanded the most thorough and professional response possible. They brought in their best investigators, their top forensic experts, and they began the painstaking process of reconstructing what had happened that night. They collected shell casings from 2 different weapons, confirming that the killer had used both a shotgun and a rifle. They found blood evidence, footprints, and other trace materials. They seized phones, computers, and other electronic devices from the property, looking for any digital evidence that might point toward a suspect or motive. They also began conducting interviews. Alex Murdaugh was questioned extensively, though he was treated as a grieving family member rather than a suspect in the initial days. Other family members were interviewed. Friends of Maggie and Paul, employees who worked at Moselle, business associates of Alex. All were asked to provide statements to account for their whereabouts, to share anything they might know about threats or conflicts or enemies the family might have had. The autopsies revealed the full extent of the horror. Paul had been shot twice with a shotgun. The first blast so devastating that it had caused catastrophic damage to his chest, shoulder, and arm. The second shot had struck his head. Either one had been immediately fatal. Maggie had been shot 4 or 5 times with a rifle, the bullet striking her in the leg, abdomen, and back. She had likely been alive for at least some of those shots, dying slowly and painfully rather than instantly like her son. The brutality of the murders was shocking even to experienced investigators who had seen their share of violence. As the days passed without any arrests or named suspects, pressure mounted on law enforcement to solve the case. The media coverage was relentless. National news outlets sent reporters to South Carolina. True crime podcasts began covering the story. The details of the Murdaugh family's history, their legal dynasty paw case, all of it was rehashed and analyzed and speculated about endlessly. The family's dirty laundry was aired publicly. Old rumors resurfaced, new theories emerged. And through it all, Alex Murdaugh maintained his role as the grieving husband and father, the devastated survivor of an unspeakable tragedy. But even as Alex mourned publicly, cracks in his story were beginning to appear. Investigators noticed inconsistencies in his timeline of events that night. His claim that he had been at his mother's house didn't quite line up with other evidence. Phone records showed activity that didn't match his account. And then there was the video that Paul had taken at 8:44 p.m., the short clip of the dog. When forensic audio experts analyzed that video, they heard voices in the background. 3 voices. One was clearly Paul. Another was Maggie. And the third voice, though Alex will later deny it, sounded remarkably like Alex Murdaugh himself. If Alex had been at the kennels at 8:44 p.m., as the video seemed to prove, then he had lied about his whereabouts. He had lied about the last time he saw his wife and son alive. And if he had lied about that, what else might he be lying about? The investigation began to shift, subtly at first, and then more overtly. Alex Murdaugh wasn't just a grieving victim anymore. He was a person of interest. And as investigators dug deeper into his background, into his finances, into his behavior in the weeks and months before the murders, they began to uncover a web of secrets that would shock even those who thought they knew the worst about the Murdaugh family. Alex Murdaugh's financial situation was far more precarious than anyone had realized. For years, he had been living a double life. On the surface, he was a successful attorney, a respected member of the community, a man who had inherited wealth and prestige and seemed to manage it all with ease. But behind that facade, Alex was drowning in debt, engaging in fraudulent schemes, and stealing money on a massive scale to maintain his lifestyle and cover his tracks. The extent of Alex Murdaugh's financial crimes would take months to fully uncover, but investigators began to piece together a pattern of behavior that stretched back years. Alex had been stealing from his own law firm, from his clients, from anyone he could manipulate or deceive. The schemes were elaborate and brazen, carried out by a man who believed his name and position made him untouchable. One of Alex's primary methods of theft involved his clients at PMPED. The law firm specialized in personal injury cases, often representing people who had been catastrophically injured in accidents and were entitled to significant settlements. These clients trusted the Murdaughs completely. Many of them came from poor, rural communities where the Murdaugh name was synonymous with justice and advocacy. They believed that Alex was fighting for them, that he had their best interests at heart, that he would ensure they received every penny they deserved. But Alex betrayed that trust in the most calculating way imaginable. When settlements were reached, he would tell his clients that the money needed to be placed in a structured account for their protection, or that certain fees needed to be paid. before they could receive their funds. He would then divert the money into accounts he controlled, often using a fake bank account he had set up under a name that sounded legitimate, Forge. The account name was designed to look like it belonged to a legitimate financial institution called Forge Consulting, a real company that handled structured settlements. But the account Alex used wasn't connected to the real Forge at all. It was his personal slush fund, and he funneled millions of dollars into it over the years. The victims of these thefts were often the most vulnerable people imaginable. One of the most heartbreaking cases involved Gloria Satterfield, a woman who had worked as the Murdaugh family's housekeeper for more than 20 years. Gloria was devoted to the family. She had helped raise Alex's sons, had been present for countless family moments, and was considered almost a member of the family herself. In February 2018, Gloria was working at the Murdaugh home when she suffered a fall on the front steps. The exact circumstances of her fall were never entirely clear, but she sustained serious head injuries and was rushed to the hospital. Gloria never recovered from her injuries. She lingered in the hospital and then in hospice care for weeks. Her family gathered around her, praying for a miracle that never came. She died on February 26, 2018, leaving behind 2 adult sons who were devastated by the loss of their mother. In the aftermath of her death, Alex Murdaugh approached Gloria's sons with what seemed like genuine concern and compassion. He told them that their mother's fall had been a tragic accident, but that they might be entitled to compensation through his homeowner's insurance policy. He said he wanted to help them, that Gloria had meant so much to his family, and that he would personally ensure they received everything they were owed. Gloria's sons, trusting Alex completely, agreed to let him represent them. Alex filed a wrongful death lawsuit against himself, a legal maneuver that would allow the insurance company to pay out a settlement. He recommended a lawyer friend to serve as a co-counsel, someone who would help process the case and make sure everything was handled properly. The sons signed the paperwork Alex put in front of them, believing that the man who had employed their mother for 2 decades would take care of them in their time of grief. The insurance companies paid out a settlement totaling over $4 million. It was a substantial sum, enough to change the lives of Gloria's sons, to provide them with financial security, and perhaps some small measure of comfort after losing their mother. But Gloria's sons never saw a penny of that money. Alex Murdaugh stole it all. He forged their signatures on documents, directed the settlement funds into his Forge account, and then simply kept the money for himself. When Gloria's sons asked about the settlement, Alex told them the case was still being processed, that these things took time, that he would let them know when the money was ready to be distributed. He lied to their faces over and over, while spending the money they should have received. This wasn't an isolated incident. Investigators would eventually discover that Alex had stolen from dozens of clients over the years. He took money from a state trooper who had been paralyzed in the line of duty. He took money from a young woman who had been brain damaged in a car accident. He took money from deaf clients, from elderly clients, from anyone who trusted him to handle their settlements. In total, the amount he stole would eventually be calculated at over $8 million, though some estimates put the figure even higher. Alex was also stealing from his own law firm. PMP was a successful practice with multiple partners, but Alex was siphoning money from the firm's accounts to feed his spending habits and cover his other debts. He would submit false expense reports, claim fees that had never been incurred, and manipulate the accounting in ways that allowed him to pocket funds without immediately noticing. The firm's finances were complex enough, and Alex's position was secure enough that he was able to get away with it for years. But by 2021, the walls were beginning to close in. The Beach family's wrongful death lawsuit related to the boat crash was proceeding, and the discovery process in that case threatened to expose Alex's financial dealings. The civil attorneys representing the Beach family were requesting detailed financial records, bank statements, and other documentation that would reveal the true state of Alex's finances. If those records were turned over, the thefts would be discovered. The fraud would be exposed. Alex would lose everything: his career, his reputation, his freedom. The Murdaugh legacy that had been built over a century would be destroyed, and it would be Alex who destroyed it. There was also trouble at PMPD. Some of Alex's partners were beginning to notice irregularities in the firm's finances. Questions were being asked of missing funds and unusual transactions. An internal audit was being discussed. The firm's CFO was starting to dig into the books more carefully. Alex was running out of time and running out of options. The pressure was immense, and it was coming from multiple directions at once. In addition to his financial crimes, Alex had developed a serious drug addiction. He had been using opioids for years, a habit that had started with prescription painkillers and escalated into a full-blown addiction that required enormous amounts of money to sustain. Friends and colleagues would later say they had no idea about the extent of his drug use. Alex was functional, or at least appeared to be. He still showed up to work, still took cases, still maintained his public persona. But privately, he was consuming massive quantities of pills, spending thousands of dollars a week on drugs, and spiraling deeper into addiction. The drugs clouded his judgment and increased his paranoia. They also drained his finances even further, creating additional pressure to steal more money to fund his habit. It was a vicious cycle, one that was spinning faster and faster as 2021 progressed. Alex was trapped between his mounting debts, his addiction, the looming exposure of his crimes, and the boat crash case that refused to go away. And in the middle of all of this chaos, his wife and son were murdered. The question that would consume investigators and the public alike was simple but profound. Did Alex Murdaugh kill his own wife and son? And if so, why? What possible motive could drive a man to commit such an unthinkable act? The answers to those questions would emerge slowly, over months of investigation. But the theory that eventually took shape was as disturbing as it was logical. Investigators theorized that Alex murdered Maggie and Paul to buy himself time and sympathy. If he was a victim of a terrible crime, a grieving husband and father who had lost everything, then the scrutiny on his finances might ease. The boat crash civil case might be delayed out of sympathy for his loss. His law partners might hesitate to push forward with questions about the firm's money. And most importantly, public attention would shift from his misdeeds to his suffering. The Murdaugh name would be associated with tragedy rather than scandal, at least temporarily. There was also the matter of Maggie's knowledge. Investigators believed it was possible that Maggie had discovered the truth about Alex's financial situation. The Beach family's lawyers had been deposing family members and requesting financial records. Maggie might have been asked questions she couldn't answer, or she might have started looking into their accounts and found discrepancies. If she knew, or was about to know, that Alex had stolen millions of dollars and destroyed their family's future, she might have left him, she might have divorced him. And a divorce would have meant full financial disclosure in court, which would have exposed everything Alex had been hiding. As for Paul, his continued existence was a financial liability. The boat crash lawsuit named him as a defendant, and his potential conviction in the criminal case would have made the civil case even more devastating for the family's finances. With Paul dead, the criminal case disappeared. The civil case became more complicated, and Alex could position himself as a victim rather than the father of a killer. It was a monstrous theory, one that suggested a level of depravity that was difficult to comprehend. But as investigators examined the evidence, the theory began to fit the facts in disturbing ways. Alex's behavior on the night of the murders, his changing stories about his timeline, his lies about being at the kennels, all of it suggested a man who was trying to construct an alibi, rather than a man who had genuinely discovered his family dead. The video Paul had taken at 8:44 p.m. became a crucial piece of evidence. Forensic analysis confirmed that Alex's voice could be heard on that video, proving he had been at the kennels mere minutes before the murders occurred. Alex had initially denied being there, had told investigators he had been up at the main house, and hadn't gone to the kennels until much later when he found the bodies. But the video contradicted that story completely. When confronted with this evidence, Alex changed his account, admitting that he had been at the kennels earlier, but claiming his memory was foggy because of his drug use and the trauma of discovering his family. Investigators also examined Alex's movements after the murders and before he called 911. His phone records showed a flurry of activity during those crucial minutes, but much of it seemed designed to establish his presence elsewhere, or to create the appearance of someone who had just arrived home. He had called Maggie's phone several times, even though if he had truly found her dead, there would have been no reason to call her. The calls seemed performative, like something someone would do if they wanted their phone records to show they were trying to reach their wife, not knowing she was already dead. The murder weapons were never found, which was itself suspicious. If the killer had been an outsider, someone who had come to Moselle specifically to murder Maggie and Paul, why would they have taken both weapons with them? It would have been risky to leave the property carrying 2 guns, especially if they had to travel any distance. But if the killer was Alex, he would have had time to hide the weapons somewhere on the vast Moselle property or dispose of them in the river before calling 911. Despite extensive searches of the property and the surrounding waterways, the guns were never recovered. There was also the matter of the dogs. The Murdaugh family kept multiple hunting dogs in kennels on the property, and these dogs would likely have barked at the approach of a stranger. But there were no reports of the dogs barking excessively that evening, no indication that they had been disturbed by an intruder. The dogs knew Alex. They wouldn't have barked at him. The forensic evidence painted a picture of a killer who had been close to the victims when they died. The shotgun used to kill Paul had been fired at very close range, close enough that the shooting seemed personal, intimate even. The killer had stood over Paul and fired a second shot into his head as he lay dying or already dead. That kind of close, range violence suggested someone who knew the victims, someone who had reason to be near them without causing alarm before the shooting started. Maggie's murder was different but equally brutal. She had been shot multiple times as she fled, the killer pursuing her and firing again and again. The pattern of the shots suggested someone who was determined to ensure she was dead, someone who wasn't panicking or firing wildly, but was methodically executing her. The use of 2 different weapons was unusual, but it also created confusion. Investigators initially thought they might be looking for 2 killers, or at least someone who had accomplices. But the evidence eventually suggested a single shooter who had simply brought 2 guns to the scene. As the investigation continued through the summer of 2021, Alex Murdaugh's behavior became increasingly erratic. He continued to maintain his innocence, continued to insist that he had nothing to do with the murders, but his actions suggested a man who was spiraling out of control. He was still using drugs heavily. He was still stealing money, even in the aftermath of the murders, as if he couldn't stop himself or didn't believe he would ever be caught. And he was making mistakes, small errors that would eventually contribute to his downfall. In early September 2021, just 3 months after the murders of Maggie and Paul, Alex's world finally collapsed. His law partners at PMPD confronted him about missing money from the firm. They had discovered irregularities in the accounts, and they demanded an explanation. Alex initially tried to deflect to explain away the discrepancies, but the evidence was too clear. On September 3, 2021, Alex resigned from the law firm. The Murdaugh family's century-long connection to PMP was severed in a single day. The next day, September 4, something even stranger happened. Alex called 911 to report that he had been shot. He said he was on the side of Old Salkehatchie Road, a rural highway not far from his home, and that someone in a passing vehicle had shot him in the head. First responders arrived to find Alex with a superficial wound to his head, bleeding but conscious and able to talk. He was airlifted to a hospital in Savannah, where he was treated for what was described as a gunshot wound. The story made headlines immediately. Alex Murdaugh, the man whose wife and son had been murdered just months earlier, had now apparently been the target of another attack. Some people immediately expressed sympathy, seeing Alex as a man who was being targeted by enemies, perhaps the same people who had killed his family. But others were skeptical. The wound didn't look like what you would expect from someone shooting at a moving vehicle from another vehicle. It looked superficial, almost staged, and Alex's story about what had happened didn't quite make sense. Law enforcement began investigating the shooting, and within days, the truth started to emerge. Alex hadn't been shot by a stranger. He had arranged the shooting himself. He had contacted a man named Curtis Eddie Smith, a former client and someone Alex had been buying drugs from for years. Alex asked Eddie to shoot him, to kill him, so that his surviving son Buster could collect on a life insurance policy worth $10 million. Eddie agreed, and they met on that rural road, where Eddie was supposed to shoot Alex in the head and make it look like a murder. But Eddie either couldn't bring himself to actually kill Alex, or he deliberately fired in a way that would cause a superficial wound rather than a fatal one. The bullet grazed Alex's head, causing a bloody but non-life-threatening injury. Eddie fled the scene, and Alex called 911, initially sticking to the story that he had been attacked by an unknown assailant. But when investigators pressed him, when they told him they had evidence that contradicted his story, Alex finally admitted the truth. He had arranged his own shooting. It was a suicide attempt of sorts, but also an insurance fraud scheme. One final desperate attempt to secure money for his son before everything came crashing down. Eddie Smith was arrested and charged with assisted suicide and other crimes. Alex was charged with insurance fraud and filing a false police report. But more importantly, the fake shooting destroyed what little credibility Alex had left. If he was willing to stage his own shooting, willing to lie about it to law enforcement and the public, what else was he willing to lie about? What else had he lied about? The questions that investigators had been quietly asking became louder and more insistent. In the days following the fake shooting, Alex checked himself into a drug rehabilitation facility, claiming he needed treatment for his opioid addiction. His attorneys released a statement saying that Alex was finally confronting his addiction and the pain that had consumed him since the murders of his wife and son. But the public was no longer buying the grieving victim narrative. Too many lies had been exposed. Too many questions remained unanswered. While Alex was in rehab, the investigations into his financial crimes accelerated. Victims began coming forward, people who had trusted Alex to handle their settlements and who now realized they had been robbed. The Satterfield family learned, to their horror, that the $4 million they should have received after Gloria's death had been stolen by the man they had trusted to help them. Other clients discovered similar thefts. The scope of Alex's fraud was staggering, and new victims seemed to emerge every week. PMP filed a lawsuit against Alex, seeking to recover the money he had stolen from the firm. The law firm that had been run by Murdaughs for generations was now suing the last Murdaugh who had been a partner. A development that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The Beach family's attorneys continued to pursue their civil case, now armed with new information about the Murdaugh's finances and Alex's criminal behavior. And effortlessly continued its investigation into the murders of Maggie and Paul, now with Alex firmly in their sights as the primary suspect. As investigators dug deeper into the events of June 7 to 21, they constructed a detailed timeline of that evening. They examined every phone call, every text message, every piece of electronic data they could find. They analyzed the video Paul had taken, the 911 call Alex had made, the movements of vehicles on and around the property. And they consulted with forensic experts about blood spatter, gunshot residue, the trajectory of bullets, and a dozen other technical details that might shed light on what had actually happened. The evidence suggested that Alex had been at the kennels with Maggie and Paul at 8:44 p.m. The video proved it. At some point very shortly after that video was taken, Alex had retrieved 2 guns, a shotgun and a rifle. Both were weapons that would have been familiar to him. Guns he had used for hunting and that were kept on the property. He had approached his son Paul first, perhaps catching him off guard, and fired the shotgun at close range. The first blast hit Paul in the chest and shoulder, causing catastrophic damage. As Paul fell, Alex fired again, this shot to the head ensuring that his son was dead. Maggie, hearing the shots or seeing what was happening, had tried to run. But she was wearing flip-flops, and the ground around the kennels was uneven. She couldn't run fast, couldn't get far. Alex pursued her with the rifle, firing as she fled. The bullets struck her in the back and legs, bringing her down. And then as she lay on the ground dying or perhaps already dead, Alex fired additional shots, making absolutely certain that his wife would not survive. The entire attack lasted perhaps a minute, maybe less. Two people who had trusted Alex completely, who had loved him and built their lives around him, were dead. And Alex, his clothes now covered in blood, had to figure out what to do next. He couldn't just leave immediately and call 911. The blood was a problem. He needed to clean up, to change clothes, to create some distance between himself and the murders. So he went back to the main house, perhaps taking the guns with him, perhaps stopping to hide them somewhere along the way. At the house, Alex showered and changed clothes. He may have tried to wash blood off his hands and arms, though forensic experts would later testify that it's nearly impossible to completely remove all traces of blood spatter after a shooting. He put his bloody clothes somewhere they wouldn't be immediately found, though exactly what he did with them remained a mystery. And then he had to decide when to call 911, when to discover the bodies in a way that would seem natural and convincing. He waited. The exact amount of time is unclear, but there was a gap between the murders and the 911 call. Time that Alex used to compose himself, to get his story straight, to prepare for the performance he would have to give as the stated husband and father. When he finally called 911 at 10:07 p.m., more than an hour had passed since Paul took that video at the kennels. An hour in which Maggie and Paul lay in blood while Alex prepared to play the role of victim. The 911 call itself, when examined closely, contained details that seemed rehearsed or performed. Alex's breathing was rapid and his voice was panicked, but some experts noted that his actual words were quite controlled. He provided the necessary information clearly. He didn't sound like someone who had just stumbled upon a horrific scene so much as someone who was acting like someone had stumbled upon a horrific scene. It was a subtle distinction, but it was there. When first responders arrived, they found Alex outside the kennels, visibly distraught. He was covered in blood, which he said came from checking the bodies, from touching his wife and son, from trying to see if there was any hope of saving them. But the blood patterns on his clothes and hands didn't entirely match that explanation. Some of the blood seemed consistent with someone who had been present when the shooting occurred, not someone who had arrived after the fact and touched the bodies. One particularly damning piece of evidence was found on Alex's clothing. Despite his claims that he had been at his mother's house and only returned to Moselle later in the evening, forensic testing found particles consistent with gunshot residue on his shirt. The presence of these particles suggested that Alex had been in very close proximity to a gun when it was fired. Closer than you would expect if he had only touched the bodies afterward. It suggested that he had been there when the shots were fired, that he might have been the one firing the gun. The investigation also revealed that Alex had made a series of phone calls in the minutes and hours before calling 911. Calls that seemed designed to establish an alibi or create a trail of evidence showing he had been elsewhere. He had called his mother's caretaker, ostensibly to check on his mother. He had called Maggie's phone several times, as if looking for her. He had called a friend, his voice appropriately worried, saying he couldn't find Maggie and Paul and was concerned. All of these calls could be seen as innocent, the actions of a worried family member. But they could also be seen as the actions of someone building a cover story, someone laying groundwork for the narrative he would present to police. One of the most chilling aspects of the case was the calculation it required. If Alex was indeed the killer, he had to plan the murders, carry them out, clean up afterward, hide the evidence, and then convincingly portray himself as a victim. He had to look his son in the eye and pull the trigger. He had to chase down his wife and shoot her multiple times as she tried to flee. And then he had to call 911 and pretend to be shocked and devastated by what he had found. It was a level of cold-blooded deception that was difficult to comprehend, even for investigators who had seen their share of terrible crimes. But as monstrous as the crime was, it fit the pattern of Alex's behavior. He had been lying and manipulating people for years, stealing from the most vulnerable, betraying the trust of clients and colleagues alike. He had faked his own shooting just months after the murders, showing a willingness to deceive law enforcement and the public without hesitation. the man who had spent his career in courtrooms, who understood the law and how evidence worked, who knew exactly what investigators would look for, had apparently believed he could commit murder and get away with it. The investigation also looked into other deaths connected to the Murdaugh family, deaths that had previously been ruled accidental, or that had never been fully investigated. Gloria Satterfield's fall at the Murdaugh home was re-examined. The circumstances of her death had always been somewhat unclear, and now investigators wondered if there was more to the story. Had she actually fallen, or had something else happened? Alex had certainly benefited from her death, stealing the insurance settlement meant for her sons. But whether he had played any role in the fall itself remained an open question. Another case that drew renewed attention was the death of Stephen Smith, a 19-year-old nursing student whose body had been found on a rural road in Hampton County in 2015. Stephen's death had been ruled a hit and run, but his family had never believed that explanation. There were injuries to Stephen's body that didn't seem consistent with being struck by a vehicle. And there had been rumors at the time that Stephen had been involved in a relationship with someone from a prominent family, rumors that had never been fully investigated. Stephen's mother had fought for years to get the case reopened, and now, with the spotlight on the Murdaughs, investigators took another look at the evidence. There was also the death of Mallory Beach, the young woman who had died in the boat crash caused by Paul Murdaugh. While that death was clearly the result of Paul's reckless actions, investigators now wondered if the Murdaughs had done more than just try to protect Paul in the aftermath. Had evidence been tampered with? Had witnesses been intimidated or influenced? The boat crash investigation was reopened, and new questions were asked about how it had been handled originally, and whether the Murdaugh family's influence had corrupted the process. The mounting evidence against Alex Murdaugh created a portrait of a man whose entire life had been built on lies and manipulation. But proving that he had murdered his wife and son required more than just establishing his financial crimes and demonstrating his capacity for deception. Investigators needed concrete evidence that would stand up in court, evidence that would convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that Alex Murdaugh had committed the unthinkable act of killing. As 2020 turned into 2022, the investigation continued with relentless focus. Moselle investigators worked closely with the South Carolina Attorney General's office, knowing that when charges were eventually filed, the case would be one of the most scrutinized trials in the state's history. They couldn't afford mistakes. They couldn't afford gaps in the evidence. Every detail had to be documented. Every piece of evidence had to be properly collected and analyzed. Every witness statement had to be verified and cross-checked. The technological evidence became increasingly important. Forensic experts examined the cell phones belonging to Alex, Maggie, and Paul, extracting every text message, every call log, every piece of data that might shed light on the events of June 7. They found that Paul's phone had stopped all activity at 8:49 p.m., just 5 minutes after he had taken the video of the dog. Maggie's phone had stopped activity moments later. The timing was significant because it established a narrow window, during which the murders must have occurred. Someone had killed both them within minutes of that video being recorded. Alex's phone showed a very different pattern. There was a period of inactivity on his phone during the critical minutes around the time of the murders, a gap that seemed suspicious. Then, after the murders would have occurred, Alex's phone showed a flurry of activity, steps being taken, the phone being moved around, calls being made. The data suggested someone who was moving around the property, perhaps hiding evidence, perhaps cleaning up, before eventually calling 911. The forensic analysis also revealed that Alex's phone had been in the area of the kennels at 8:44 p.m., further confirming had already suggested Alex had lied about not being there. When this evidence was presented to Alex through his attorneys, he changed his story yet again, now claiming that yes, he had been at the kennels briefly, but had left before the murders occurred. He said his memory had been foggy due to his drug use, and he hadn't remembered being there when he first spoke to investigators. But the constant changing of his story only made him appear more guilty, more like someone trying to adjust his lies to fit the evidence. rather than someone simply telling the truth. Financial records painted a picture of a man who was desperate in the days and weeks before the murders. Alex had been facing increasing pressure from multiple directions. The Beach family's lawsuit was proceeding toward trial, and the financial discovery in that case would have exposed his thefts. His law partners were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about missing money. His drug dealer was demanding payment for drugs that Alex had purchased on credit. He was juggling debts, writing bad checks, and running out of places to hide. In one particularly damning detail, investigators discovered that on the morning of June 10, 2021, the very day of the murders, Alex's law partners had confronted him about a missing fee payment that should have been deposited into the firm's account. They demanded an explanation and told him they would be conducting a full audit of his cases. That confrontation happened at around 4 p.m. By 10 p.m. that same day, Maggie and Paul were dead. The timing suggested a man who had been cornered, who saw his world collapsing around him, and who made a desperate decision to try to save himself. With Maggie and Paul dead, Alex became an object of sympathy rather than suspicion. The boat crash case became more complicated, potentially less damaging to the family's finances, and the scrutiny on Alex's financial dealings might be delayed or diminished as people focused instead on the tragedy that had befallen him. Investigators also examined Alex's behavior in the months following the murders, looking for evidence of guilt or consciousness of wrongdoing. They found plenty. Alex had continued stealing money even after the murders, taking funds from clients in the law firm, as if he believed he could still get away with it. He had arranged the fake shooting with Eddie Smith, demonstrating his willingness to lie to law enforcement and stage crimes for his own benefit. He had given conflicting statements about his whereabouts and actions on the night of the murders, changing his story multiple times as new evidence emerged. All of this painted a picture of a man who was not an innocent victim, but rather someone trying desperately to avoid being caught. The grand jury proceedings began in early 2022, with prosecutors presenting their evidence to a panel of citizens who would decide whether there was probable cause to indict Alex Murdaugh for murder. The proceedings were conducted in secret, as grand jury deliberations always are, but word leaked out that the evidence being presented was substantial and damning. Witnesses testified about Alex's financial crimes, about his lies, about the inconsistencies in his statements. Forensic experts presented their findings about the gunshot residue, the blood evidence, the timeline of events. Cell phone data was shown demonstrating that Alex had been at the kennels when he claimed he hadn't been. On July 14, 2022, more than a year after the murders, Alex Murdaugh was formally indicted on 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime. The charges were announced at a press conference, and the news spread rapidly across South Carolina and then across the nation. The scion of a legal dynasty, a man whose family had represented law and order for nearly a century, was now accused of murdering his own wife and son. The fall from grace was complete and spectacular. Alex was arrested and denied bond. He was already in custody on other charges related to his financial crimes, but now he faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison for murder. His attorneys immediately began preparing his defense, knowing they faced an uphill battle. The evidence was substantial, the public sentiment was against them, and their client had already been caught in so many lies that his credibility was essentially non-existent. As Alex sat in jail awaiting trial, more details about his crimes continued to emerge. The South Carolina Attorney General's office was pursuing dozens of financial crime charges against him, representing millions of dollars in theft from clients and his law firm. Each new indictment added to the portrait of a man who had been living a completely fraudulent life, stealing from the vulnerable while presenting himself as their advocate, betraying everyone who had trusted him. The victims of his financial crimes began to come forward publicly, telling their stories of how Alex had stolen from them. Some were elderly people who had been injured and trusted Alex to secure their futures. Others were families of people who had died. People like the Satterfield family who had lost a loved one and then been robbed by the very person who claimed to want to help them. The stories were heartbreaking. and they revealed the scope of Alex's betrayal. He hadn't just stolen money, he had stolen hope, security, and justice from people who had already suffered devastating losses. The trial was scheduled for early 2023, giving both sides time to prepare for what would undoubtedly be a lengthy and complex proceeding. The prosecution would have to prove not just that Alex was capable of murder, not just that he had motive and opportunity, but that he had actually committed the act. They would need to present a cohesive narrative that explained how and why Alex had killed his wife and son, backed up by physical evidence, witness testimony, and expert analysis. The defense faced the challenge of explaining away the mountain of evidence against their client. They would have to account for lies Alex had told, the gunshot residue on his clothing, the cell phone data that placed him at the scene, and the financial desperation that gave him motive. They would need to present an alternative theory of the crime, to suggest who else might have wanted to kill Maggie and Paul, and to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. As the trial date approached, public interest in the case reached a fever pitch. News outlets from around the country sent reporters to South Carolina to cover the proceedings. True crime enthusiasts followed every development, analyzing the evidence, debating Alex's guilt or innocence, and speculating about what the trial might reveal. The Murdaugh name, which had once commanded respect and admiration, had become synonymous with corruption, betrayal, and murder. The trial began on January 23, 2023 in the Colleton County Courthouse in Waldoboro, South Carolina. The courthouse was a modest building, not designed for the media circus that descended upon it. Satellite trucks lined the streets. Reporters set up cameras outside. People lined up for hours hoping to get a seat in the courtroom gallery. Inside, the atmosphere was tense and expectant. This was more than just a murder trial. This was the final chapter in the downfall of a dynasty, and everyone wanted to witness it. Judge Clifton Newman presided over the proceedings with a firm but fair hand. He was a respected jurist who understood the gravity of the case and the need to ensure that both sides received a fair trial despite the intense public scrutiny. The jury selection process had been exhaustive, with both sides working to find 12 citizens who could set aside what they had heard about the case and judge the evidence on its merits. It was a nearly impossible task given the saturation coverage the case had received, but eventually a jury was seated 12 people who would hold Alex Murdaugh's fate in their hands. The prosecution's opening statement laid out their case with methodical precision. Lead prosecutor Creighton Waters told the jury that this was a case about a man who had been living a lie for years, a man who had stolen millions of dollars from vulnerable people, a man whose carefully constructed facade was about to crumble on June 7, 2021. Waters explained that Alex had been confronted by his law partners about missing money that very afternoon, that he knew his financial crimes were about to be exposed, and that he had murdered his wife and son in a desperate attempt to buy time and sympathy. Waters told the jury about the cell phone evidence that proved Alex had lied about his whereabouts. He described the gunshot residue found on Alex's clothing, the blood spatter evidence, and the timeline that showed Alex had opportunity to commit the murders. He explained that Alex had used 2 different weapons to try to confuse investigators, to make it appear that multiple people might have been involved, or that the murders were the work of someone unfamiliar with the property. And he promised to show the jury that Alex's financial desperation had driven him to commit an act of almost incomprehensible evil. The defense's opening statement took a different approach. Defense attorney Jim Griffin acknowledged that Alex Murdaugh was a liar, a thief, and a drug addict. He didn't try to defend Alex's character or his financial crimes, but he argued that being a bad person didn't make Alex a murderer. Griffin told the jury that the state's case was built on circumstantial evidence, that there was no direct proof that Alex had pulled the trigger, and that the timeline and physical evidence actually suggested that Alex couldn't have committed the murders. Griffin argued that the murders must have been committed by someone else, someone who had a grudge against the family or who wanted revenge for something. He pointed to the boat crash case and suggested that someone seeking vengeance for Mallory Beach's death might have targeted Paul and Maggie. He noted that the murder weapons had never been found, that there were no witnesses to the actual killings, and that the state's case relied too heavily on speculation and assumptions. He asked the jury to look at the evidence carefully, and to remember that the burden of proof was on the prosecution. The prosecution began presenting its case with a parade of witnesses who established the basic facts of the crime. First responders testified about arriving at Moselle and finding the bodies of Maggie and Paul near the kennels. They described the horrific nature of the injuries, the amount of blood at the scene, and Alex's demeanor when they arrived. Some testified that Alex seemed distraught and devastated. Others noted details that seemed off: the way Alex was on his phone during those first moments, the way he seemed to be trying to control the scene even as law enforcement was arriving. The coroner testified about the autopsies, describing in clinical detail the wounds that had killed Maggie and Paul. Paul had been shot twice with a shotgun loaded with buckshot, once in the chest and once in the head. The chest wound had been catastrophic, tearing through his shoulder and upper body with devastating force. The head wound had been fired at close range while Paul was already down, suggesting an execution-style killing. Maggie had been shot multiple times with a rifle, the bullets entering her back and legs as she tried to flee. She had likely been conscious for at least some of the shots, dying slowly and in terror. The coroner's testimony was difficult to hear, made worse by the fact that Alex was sitting just feet away. The man accused of inflicting those terrible wounds on his own family. Forensic experts testified about the ballistics evidence. They explained that 2 different weapons had been used, a shotgun for Paul and a rifle for Maggie. The guns were identified as a 12-gauge shotgun and a .300 blackout rifle. Both weapons commonly used for hunting and both types of guns that the Murdaugh family owned. But the specific weapons used in the murders had never been recovered, despite extensive searches of the property and the surrounding area. The prosecution argued that Alex had hidden or disposed of the weapons after the murders, using his knowledge of the property to find a place where they would never be found. The testimony about gunshot residue was particularly damaging. An expert explained that particles consistent with gunshot residue had been found on Alex's hands and clothing when he was tested after the murders. These particles suggested that Alex had been in very close proximity to a gun when it was discharged, much closer than would be expected if he had merely touched the bodies afterward. The defense tried to argue that the particles could have come from touching the bodies or being near the crime scene. But the expert testified that the pattern and location of the particles were more consistent with someone who had been present when the guns were fired. Blood spatter evidence was also presented. An expert testified about the blood found on Alex's clothing, explaining that some of the patterns were consistent with what you would expect if someone had been standing near the victims when they were shot. The defense argued that Alex had touched the bodies when he found them, which could explain the blood. But the prosecution countered that the specific patterns and locations of the blood suggested something more than just contact with the bodies. The testimony was technical and complex, full of terms like high-velocity impact spatter and transfer stains, but the bottom line was clear: the blood evidence suggested Alex had been present during the violence, not just after it. The cell phone evidence was perhaps the most compelling part of the prosecution's case. Experts testified about the data extracted from the phones of Alex, Maggie, and Paul. They showed that Paul's phone had recorded him taking a video at 8:44 p.m., a video that captured audio of 3 voices: Paul's, Maggie's, and a third voice that sounded like Alex. The video was played in court, and even though the audio was somewhat unclear, the presence of that third voice was undeniable. Alex had initially denied being at the kennels at that time, but the video proved he had been there. The phone data also showed that Paul and Maggie's phones had stopped all activity at 8:49 p.m. and 8:50 p.m. respectively, just minutes after the video was recorded. The timing suggested that they had been killed during that narrow window, within minutes of the video being taken. Alex's phone showed no activity during those crucial minutes, as if he had deliberately turned it off or put it aside. But then, starting at 9:02 p.m., Alex's phone showed a burst of activity movement, steps being recorded, the phone being picked up and used. The The pattern suggested someone who had committed the murders and was now moving around, perhaps cleaning up, perhaps hiding evidence, before eventually calling 911 more than an hour later. One of the most dramatic moments of the trial came when Paul's video was played in court. The video itself was innocuous, just a few seconds of footage showing one of the family's dogs. But the audio in the background captured what sounded like a normal family moment: Paul talking to the dog, Maggie saying something in the background, and that third voice, calm and casual, completely at odds with what would happen just minutes later. Knowing what came next, knowing that the people on that video would be dead within minutes, gave the recording a chilling quality. Several jurors were visibly affected, and even the judge seemed moved by the weight of what they were hearing. Alex's lies about being at the kennels became a central focus of the prosecution's case. Prosecutor Waters hammered away at this point again and again. Alex had lied about where he was. He had lied about the last time he saw his wife and son alive. And when confronted with evidence that proved his lies, he had simply changed his story. Waters argued that innocent people don't lie about the whereabouts when their family is murdered. Innocent people tell the truth, even if the truth is complicated or confusing. Only guilty people lie, and only guilty people keep changing their lies when they get caught. The defense tried to explain away Alex's lies by pointing to his drug addiction and the trauma of discovering his family dead. They argued that Alex's memory was unreliable, that the opioids he had been taking for years had affected his ability to recall events accurately, and that the shock of finding Maggie and Paul dead had further confused his memories. But the prosecution countered that Alex's lies had been too specific and too consistent to be the result of confused memory. He hadn't simply forgotten he was at the kennels. He had explicitly denied it, had constructed an alternative timeline that placed him elsewhere, and had only admitted the truth when confronted with video evidence that made continued lying impossible. Witnesses testified about Alex's financial crimes, establishing his motive for the murders. The jury heard from victims who had been robbed by Alex, people who had trusted him completely and been betrayed. They heard about the millions of dollars Alex had stolen, the elaborate schemes he had used to hide his thefts, and the mounting pressure he had faced as his crimes were about to be exposed. The Satterfield sons testified about how Alex had stolen their settlement after their mother's death, lying to them for years about where the money was while spending it on himself. Their testimony was powerful and emotional, showing the jury exactly what kind of man Alex Murdaugh was. The prosecution presented evidence about the confrontation at PMP'd on the afternoon of June 7, 2021. Alex's law partners testified that they had questioned him about a missing fee payment, that they had told him they were going to conduct a full audit of his cases, and that Alex had seemed rattled and evasive. The timing was crucial. This confrontation happened just hours before the murders. The prosecution argued that Alex knew the audit would expose his thefts, that he was out of options and out of time, and that he murdered Maggie and Paul in a desperate attempt to create a distraction and buy himself sympathy. The defense called their own experts to challenge the prosecution's forensic evidence. They brought in specialists who questioned the reliability of gunshot residue testing, who suggested alternative explanations for the blood on Alex's clothing, and who argued that the cell phone data was being misinterpreted. But the defense experts were fighting an uphill battle. The prosecution's evidence was substantial, and it came from multiple independent sources, all pointing in the same direction. Alex's drug dealer, Curtis Eddie Smith, testified about the fake shooting incident in September 2021. Eddie described how Alex had contacted him and asked him to kill Alex so that Buster could collect insurance money. He testified that he had agreed, that they had met on that rural road, and that he had shot Alex in the head, though not fatally. Eddie's testimony established that Alex was willing to stage crimes and lie to law enforcement, that he was capable of elaborate deception, and that he had no qualms about using violence to achieve his goals. The fake shooting incident, while not directly related to the murders, painted a picture of a man who was desperately trying to manipulate events and people to his advantage. The defense's biggest challenge was explaining why Alex would kill his own wife and son. The prosecution's theory, That he did it to buy time and sympathy seemed rational but also monstrous. Could a father really kill his own child just to delay the exposure of his financial crimes? Could a husband really murder his wife to avoid a divorce that would reveal his thefts? The defense argued that no amount of financial pressure could drive a person to such an extreme act, that the prosecution's motive didn't make sense, and that there had to be another explanation. But the prosecution countered that the motive made perfect sense once you understood who Alex Murdaugh really was. This wasn't a normal person facing normal problems. This was a man who had been lying and stealing for years, a man who had betrayed everyone who trusted him, a man who had constructed an entire false identity and would do anything to protect it. For Alex, the murders weren't about money or avoiding prison. They were about preserving the image he had spent his entire life building, the image of the successful Murdaugh heir, the respected attorney, the family man. He had already committed so many terrible acts in service of that image. The murders were just the final, most extreme step in a long pattern of selfish, destructive behavior. Throughout the trial, Alex sat at the defense table, sometimes taking notes, sometimes staring ahead with a blank expression, sometimes weeping as witnesses described the deaths of his wife and son. It was impossible to know what he was thinking, whether he felt any genuine remorse for what had happened, or whether he was simply focused on trying to avoid conviction. His attorneys had advised him not to testify, knowing that the prosecution would tear him apart on cross-examination, that his lies and his crimes would be exposed in devastating detail if he took the stand. But as the prosecution rested its case and the defense began its presentation, a decision was made that shocked everyone in the courtroom. Alex Murdaugh would testify in his own defense. It was a risky move, potentially catastrophic, but the defense apparently believed they had no choice. The evidence against Alex was so substantial that simply presenting expert witnesses and arguing about forensics wasn't going to be enough. The jury needed to hear from Alex himself, needed to hear him explain his actions, his lies, and most importantly, needed to hear him deny that he had murdered his family. When Alex Murdaugh took the stand on February 23, 2023, the courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and family members from both sides. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The moment when the accused murderer would finally have to answer questions under oath, face his accusers, and try to explain away the mountain of evidence that had been presented against him. The tension in the room was palpable. Every eye was fixed on Alex as he was sworn in and took his seat in the witness box. His own attorney, Jim Griffin, began the direct examination with relatively gentle questions designed to humanize Alex and establish his relationship with Maggie and Paul. Alex spoke about meeting Maggie in college, about their courtship and marriage, about the early years when they were building their life together. He described her as his best friend, his partner, the love of his life. His voice broke as he talked about her kindness, her warmth, the way she had devoted herself to their family. He painted a picture of a marriage that had been happy and strong, a relationship built on love and mutual respect. When discussing Paul, Alex became even more emotional. He talked about Paul's birth, about watching him grow up, about the joy Paul had brought to their lives. He described Paul as energetic and fun-loving, someone who lit up every room he entered, someone who had been excited about life and full of potential. Alex spoke about their shared love of hunting and fishing, about the hours they had spent together at Moselle, about the bond between father and son. Tears streamed down Alex's face as he talked, and he had to pause several times to compose himself. But Griffin also had to address the elephant in the room, Alex's lies and his financial crimes. Alex admitted, under questioning from his own attorney, that he had been stealing money for years. He acknowledged taking funds from clients, from his law firm, from people who had trusted him completely. He said his drug addiction had spiraled out of control, that he had needed massive amounts of money to feed his habit, and that he had made terrible decisions that he deeply regretted. He claimed that his addiction had clouded his judgment, that the drugs had made him into someone he didn't recognize, someone capable of betraying the people who depended on him. Alex also addressed his lies about being at the kennels on the night of the murders. He admitted that he had lied to investigators when they first questioned him, that he had told them he hadn't been at the kennels that evening, when in fact he had been there just minutes before Maggie and Paul were killed. He claimed that his lying was a result of his drug addiction and paranoia. He said that for years he had been lying about so many things, hiding his drug use and his financial crimes, that lying had become almost reflexive. When the investigators asked him about the kennels, he said he panicked and lied without even thinking about it, worried that admitting he had been there would make him look guilty. But Alex was adamant about one thing: he had not killed his wife and son. He looked directly at the jury as he said it, his voice firm despite the tears on his face. He said he could never have hurt Maggie or Paul, that they were the most important people in his life, that losing them had destroyed him. He said that whoever killed them had taken everything from him, had left him with nothing but grief and emptiness. He insisted that he was innocent, that he was a victim of terrible tragedy, not the perpetrator of it. The direct examination lasted for hours, with Griffin carefully walking Alex through his version of events from June 7, 2021. Alex testified that he had been at the kennels with Maggie and Paul around 8:45 p.m., that they had been looking at one of the dogs together, and that Paul had taken the video that had become such crucial evidence. He said he had then driven up to his mother's house to visit her, as she was in poor health, and he tried to see her every day. He claimed he had spent about 45 minutes with his mother and her caretaker, talking and checking on her condition. Alex testified that he had then driven back to Moselle, arriving around 10 p.m. He said he had found the main house empty, and had become concerned when Maggie didn't answer his calls. He said he had driven down to the kennels, thinking they might still be there with the dogs, and that's when he had discovered their bodies. He described the horror of that moment, the way his mind couldn't process what he was seeing, the desperate attempts to check for signs of life, even though it was immediately obvious that both Maggie and Paul were dead. He said he had called 911 in a panic, that he had touched the bodies trying to see if there was any hope, and that the blood on his hands and clothes had come from those moments of desperate checking and touching. He denied firing any weapons that night. He denied being the killer. He said that whoever murdered his family was still out there, that the real perpetrator had never been caught, and that he was being wrongly accused because investigators had focused on him too early and ignored other possibilities. But then came the cross-examination, and that's when Alex's testimony began to fall apart. Lead prosecutor Creighton Waters approached the witness stand with a calm, methodical demeanor that belied the devastating questions he was about to ask. Waters had been preparing for this moment for months, and he had a strategy. He would use his own words, his own lies, and his own actions to destroy his credibility in front of the jury. Waters began by focusing on Alex's lies. He went through them systematically, one by one, showing the jury just how often and how easily Alex had lied about important matters. Waters asked Alex about lying to investigators about being at the kennels. Alex admitted it. Waters asked about lying to his law partners about the missing money. Alex admitted it. Waters asked about lying to clients whose settlements he had stolen. Alex admitted it. Waters asked about lying to the Satterfield family about their insurance settlement. Alex admitted it. The pattern was clear and damning. Alex Murdaugh was a habitual liar who would say whatever was convenient at any given moment. Waters then moved to the question of why the jury should believe Alex now. If Alex had lied about so many things, if he had shown himself willing to lie to law enforcement, to his family, to people who trusted him, why should anyone believe his claims of innocence? Alex tried to explain that this was different, that he had lied about other things but was telling the truth about the murders. But the argument rang hollow. How could the jury distinguish between Alex's lies and his truth when he had proven himself so thoroughly untrustworthy? Waters confronted Alex with the video Paul had taken at 8:44 p.m. He played it in court again, making sure the jury heard the three voices: Paul, Maggie, and that third voice that forensic experts had testified was Alex. Waters asked Alex directly, "That's your voice on the video, isn't it?" Alex hesitated, then admitted that yes, it sounded like him. Waters pressed, "And so you were at the kennels at 8:44 p.m. just minutes before your wife and son were murdered." Alex agreed that he had been there but insisted he had left before anything happened. Waters then walked through the timeline minute by minute, showing how implausible Alex's story was. If Alex had been at the kennels at 8:44 p.m. and had then driven to his mother's house, he would have had to leave almost immediately after the video was taken. But Alex had testified that he had spent time at the kennels with Maggie and Paul, that they had been interacting normally, that nothing had seemed wrong. So when exactly had he left? Alex's answers became vague and uncertain. He claimed he couldn't remember the exact timing, that everything from that night was confused in his memory. Waters pointed out that Alex's phone showed no activity during the critical minutes after 8:44 p.m., the same minutes when Maggie and Paul's phones stopped working forever. Wasn't it suspicious that Alex's phone went silent at exactly the time the murders occurred? Alex claimed he must put his phone down, that he often didn't have it on him, that there was nothing suspicious about it. But Waters countered with data showing that Alex was normally very active on his phone, constantly checking it, making calls, sending texts. The sudden silence was out of character and exactly coincided with the murders. Waters then addressed Alex's claim that he had been at his mother's house during the murders. He pointed out that the drive from the kennels to his mother's house took about 6 or 7 minutes. If Alex had left the kennels shortly after 8:44 p.m., he should have arrived at his mother's house around 8:50 p.m., but there was no evidence of that. No phone calls made from her house at that time, no GPS data showing his vehicle there. No concrete proof that he had been there when he claimed. His mother's caretaker had testified that Alex had visited that evening, but she couldn't remember the exact time, and her testimony had been vague about the details. Waters suggested an alternative timeline. Alex had been at the kennels at 4:04 p.m., as the video proved. He had then murdered Maggie and Paul in the minutes that followed. He had gone back to the main house to clean up, change clothes, and hide the weapons. He had then driven to his mother's house to establish an alibi, staying there long enough to be seen and remembered. And finally he had returned to Moselle and called 911, pretending to have just discovered the bodies. This timeline fit the evidence much better than Alex's version of events. Alex denied this vehemently, insisting that he would never have hurt his family, that the prosecution's timeline was wrong, that there were gaps and assumptions in their theory. But Waters kept pressing, kept pointing out the inconsistencies and the lies, kept showing the jury that Alex's story didn't hold up under scrutiny. One of the most damaging parts of the cross-examination came when Waters asked Alex about his behavior in the days and weeks after the murders. Waters pointed out that Alex had continued stealing money even after Maggie and Paul were dead. He had taken funds from clients, had written bad checks, had maintained his fraudulent schemes as if nothing had happened. Waters asked, "If you were truly devastated by the loss of your wife and son, if you were grieving as you claim, why were you still stealing money? Why were you still lying and scheming and betraying people's trust?" Alex had no good answer. He claimed that his addiction had been so overwhelming that he couldn't control his actions, that he had been operating on autopilot, that the grief and the drugs had combined to make him not himself. But the explanation sounded weak and self-serving. It was clear that even after the murders, Alex had been focused on protecting himself, on maintaining his lifestyle, on covering his tracks. Waters also hammered Alex on the fake shooting incident with Curtis Eddie Smith. He asked Alex to explain why, just 3 months after his wife and son were murdered, he had arranged for someone to shoot him in the head. Alex claimed it had been a suicide attempt driven by grief and depression, that he had wanted to die, but had wanted Buster to get the insurance money. But Waters pointed out that this wasn't really a suicide attempt at all. It was another fraud, another scheme, another lie. Alex had arranged for someone else to shoot him in a non-fatal way so that his death would look like a murder, allowing Buster to collect insurance money that wouldn't have been paid out for a suicide. Waters suggested that the fake shooting revealed Alex's true character. Even in his supposed darkest moment, even when claiming to be suicidal, Alex was really just running another con, trying to get money through deception. And if Alex was capable of staging his own shooting and lying about it to law enforcement. Wasn't he also capable of staging the murders of his wife and son and lying about those too? The cross-examination was brutal and relentless. Waters spent hours dismantling Alex's testimony, exposing his lies, highlighting the contradictions in his story, and showing the jury that nothing Alex said could be trusted. By the time Waters finished, Alex looked exhausted and defeated. His earlier confidence had evaporated. His tears seemed less like genuine grief and more like the desperate emotional appeals of a man who knew he was losing. The defense tried to rehabilitate Alex on redirect examination, giving him opportunities to explain his answers and clarify his testimony. But the damage had been done. The jury had seen Alex lie and change his story under pressure. They had seen him unable to explain away the evidence. They had seen him exposed as a fraud, a thief, and a manipulator. Whether they believed he was also a murderer would depend on how they weighed all the evidence together. After Alex's testimony concluded, both sides called additional witnesses and presented final pieces of evidence. The defense brought in character witnesses who testified that Alex had been a loving father and husband, that he had seemed devastated by the murders, and that they couldn't believe he would be capable of such violence. But these witnesses couldn't explain away the physical evidence, the lies, or the timeline that placed Alex at the scene of the crime. The prosecution brought in rebuttal witnesses who challenged some of the defense's claims and reinforced key points of their case. They also presented evidence about Alex's financial situation in the days before the murders, showing just how desperate he had been, how close he had been to complete exposure and ruin. The pressure on Alex had been immense and building for months, and the murders had occurred at the exact moment when that pressure reached its peak. The closing arguments began on March 1, 2023. After nearly 6 weeks of testimony, Prosecutor Creighton Waters stood before the jury and delivered a powerful summation of the state's case. He told the jury that this was a case about a man who had been living a lie, who had built his entire life on deception and theft, and who had committed murder when that life was about to collapse around him. Waters walked through the evidence methodically. He reminded the jury about the video that proved Alex had lied about being at the kennels. He discussed the gunshot residue and blood evidence that suggested Alex had been present during the shooting. He highlighted the cell phone data that showed Alex's phone going silent during the murders and then becoming active again as he moved around the property. He talked about Alex's financial crimes and the pressure he was under on June 7, 2021, when his law partners confronted him and set in motion an audit that would expose everything. Waters argued that Alex had murdered Maggie and Paul to buy himself time and sympathy, to create a distraction from his financial crimes, and to manipulate the situation to his advantage. He pointed out that Alex's first instinct after the murders was to lie, to construct an alibi, to try to control the narrative. Innocent people don't do that. Innocent people tell the truth. Waters also addressed the question that surely weighed on everyone's mind. How could a father kill his own son? How could a husband murder his wife? Waters acknowledged that it was almost impossible to comprehend such an act, that it seemed to violate every natural human instinct. But he argued that Alex Murdaugh wasn't operating from normal human instincts. He was a man who had been lying, cheating, and stealing for years. He was a man who had put his own selfish needs above everyone else's, who had betrayed the trust of the most vulnerable people, who had shown himself capable of monstrous acts of deception. Waters told the jury that Alex's love for himself, for his image, for the preservation of his lifestyle and reputation, had ultimately been greater than his love for his family. In the moment when he was cornered and desperate, when exposure seemed inevitable, Alex had made a calculation. He could sacrifice Maggie and Paul, use their deaths to manipulate sympathy and buy time, and perhaps escape the consequences of his crimes. It was a cold, rational decision made by a man who had spent his entire adult life manipulating people and situations to his advantage. The defense's closing argument took a different approach. Attorney Jim Griffin acknowledged Alex's flaws, but argued that the prosecution hadn't proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt. He pointed out that there were no witnesses to the murders, that the murder weapons had never been found, and that the prosecution's case was built largely on circumstantial evidence and speculation. Griffin argued that the prosecution's timeline didn't make sense. They were asking the jury to believe that Alex had murdered his wife and son in a matter of minutes, cleaned himself up, hidden the weapons, driven to his mother's house to establish an alibi, and then returned to Moselle to call 911, all while showing no signs of panic or distress to the people he encountered. Griffin suggested this was implausible, that the prosecution was asking the jury to believe in a perfect crime carried out by a man who was supposedly desperate and drug-addled. Griffin also suggested alternative theories. He reminded the jury about the boat crash case and the possibility that someone seeking revenge for Mallory Beach's death might have targeted Paul. He noted that there were people in the community who blamed Paul for Mallory's death, who might have wanted him to pay for what he had done. And once Paul was targeted, Maggie might have simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, a witness who had to be eliminated. But Griffin's arguments faced a fundamental problem. The defense hadn't presented any concrete evidence pointing to an alternative suspect. They hadn't shown that anyone else had motive, means, an opportunity to commit the murders. Their theory relied on speculation and possibility rather than proof. And in the absence of any other viable suspect, the evidence all pointed in one direction toward Alex Murdaugh. The jury received the case on March 2, 2023, and began their deliberations. They had heard 6 weeks of testimony, seen hundreds of pieces of evidence, and listened to hours of arguments from both sides. Now they had to decide, had the prosecution proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Alex Murdaugh had murdered his wife and son? Or was there enough uncertainty, enough gaps in the evidence, to justify acquittal? The deliberations lasted less than 3 hours. In the world of criminal trials, particularly murder trials, that was remarkably fast. It suggested that the jury had found the evidence compelling, and the verdict relatively straightforward. When word came that the jury had reached a decision, the courtroom filled quickly. Alex was brought in looking anxious and pale. The families of both Maggie and Paul were present, as were supporters of Alex and members of the community who had followed the case from the beginning. Judge Newman asked the jury foreman if they had reached a verdict. The foreman confirmed that they had. The clerk read the verdicts aloud. In the matter of the state of South Carolina versus Richard Alexander Murdaugh, on the charge of the murder of Margaret Kennedy Murdaugh, we the jury find the defendant guilty. On the charge of the murder of Paul Terry Murdaugh, we the jury find the defendant guilty. On the charges of possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime, we the jury find the defendant guilty on both counts. Guilty. Guilty on all counts. Alex Murdaugh, the heir to a legal dynasty, the man whose family had represented law and order of the Low Country for nearly a century, had been convicted of murdering his own wife and son. The verdict sent shockwaves through the courtroom and across the nation. Some people gasping. Alex himself showed little visible reaction, staring straight ahead as if unable to process what had just happened. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following day, and it would prove to be just as dramatic as the trial itself. Judge Newman had a reputation for thoughtful, carefully considered sentences, and everyone expected him to impose the maximum penalty given the severity of the crimes. But no one was prepared for the emotional weight of the hearing, or the powerful words the judge would speak. Members of Maggie and Paul's family were given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing. They spoke about their loss, about the pain of losing loved ones to violence, about the betrayal they felt knowing that someone who should have protected Maggie and Paul had instead killed them. They talked about how the murders had shattered their sense of safety and trust, how they would never be able to understand why Alex had done what he did. The Beach family also spoke. Representatives of Mallory's parents addressing the court about how Paul's actions had taken their daughter, and how Alex's actions had denied them the justice they deserved in the boat crash case. They noted that with Paul's death, the criminal case against him had ended, leaving them without the closure of a trial and conviction. When it was time for sentencing, Judge Newman addressed Alex directly. He spoke about the responsibility that comes with privilege and power, about how the Murdaugh family had been entrusted with upholding the law for generations, and how Alex had betrayed that trust in the most profound way imaginable. He talked about the evidence in the case, about the lies Alex had told, and about the cold calculation that must have gone into planning and executing the murders. Judge Newman said that he presided over many cases in his career, had seen many terrible crimes, but that this case stood out for its sheer betrayal and cruelty. He noted that Alex had stood in courtrooms for years, arguing for justice on behalf of his clients, while secretly stealing from those same clients and ultimately murdering his own family when his crimes were about to be exposed. The judge sentenced Alex Murdaugh to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, 1 for each murder. He also imposed additional sentences for the weapons charges, though those were largely symbolic given that Alex would never be eligible for release. The message was clear: Alex Murdaugh would spend the rest of his life in prison. He would die behind bars, never again experiencing freedom, never again able to manipulate or deceive or harm anyone outside the prison walls. As Alex was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his face remained expressionless. It was impossible to know what he was thinking or feeling. Did he feel remorse for what he had done? Did he still believe he might somehow overturn the conviction on appeal? Or had he simply shut down emotionally, unable to process the magnitude of his fall from grace? The conviction of Alex Murdaugh brought a measure of closure to some, but it also opened new chapters in understanding the full scope of his crimes and the damage he had inflicted on countless lives. In the weeks and months following the guilty verdict, investigators continued to unravel the web of deception that Alex had spun over decades. What they discovered was even more extensive and disturbing than anyone had initially realized. The financial crimes alone were staggering in their breadth and audacity. Prosecutors eventually charged Alex with nearly 100 additional criminal counts related to theft, fraud, money laundering, and other financial crimes. Each charge represented another victim, another person or family that Alex had betrayed and stolen from. The total amount of money involved exceeded $10 million, though some estimates placed the figure even higher when accounting for interest, penalties, and the long-term financial damage his thefts had caused. The victims came from all walks of life, but they shared a common thread: they had all been vulnerable when they encountered Alex Murdaugh. Some had been catastrophically injured in accidents and couldn't work or advocate for themselves. Others had lost loved ones and were too grief-stricken to scrutinize the legal processes Alex managed on their behalf. Many came from poor, rural communities where the Murdaugh name carried such weight that questioning Alex's integrity would have seemed almost unthinkable. One particularly heartbreaking case involved a deaf client who had been injured in an accident. Alex had secured a substantial settlement for this client, but had then stolen most of the money, leaving the victim with a fraction of what they were owed. The victim had no way of knowing they had been robbed, couldn't effectively communicate with others about the situation, and had trusted Alex completely because of his reputation. When the theft was finally discovered years later, the victim's life had been permanently affected by the missing funds that should have provided security and care. Another case involved a state highway patrol trooper named Thomas Moore, who had been catastrophically injured in the line of duty. Moore had been left paralyzed from the waist down after a traffic accident, and Alex had represented him in a lawsuit that resulted in a settlement of over $1 million. But Moore never received the full amount he was owed. Alex had diverted hundreds of thousands of dollars into his own accounts, stealing from a man who had dedicated his life to public service and who now needed every penny for medical care and living expenses. The Satterfield case remained one of the most egregious examples of Alex's cruelty. Gloria Satterfield had worked for the Murdaugh family for more than 2 decades. She had been loyal, devoted, and hardworking. When she died from injuries sustained in a fall at the Murdaugh home, Alex had approached her sons with what appeared to be genuine compassion and concern. He had promised to help them secure compensation through his insurance, had recommended attorneys to assist them, and had assured them he would take care of everything. But every word had been a lie. Alex had orchestrated the entire process to enrich himself. He had filed the lawsuit, secured a settlement of over $4 million, and then stolen all of it. He had forged the Satterfield sons' signatures on documents, created fake bank accounts, and constructed an elaborate scheme to make the money disappear into his own pockets. For years, when Gloria's sons asked about the settlement, Alex had looked them in the eye and lied, telling them the process was still ongoing, that these things took time, that he was working on it. The Satterfield sons had trusted Alex completely. Their mother had loved the Murdaugh family, had spoken highly of them, had considered them almost like her own family. The betrayal they felt when they finally learned the truth was profound and devastating. Not only had they lost their mother, but they had been robbed by the very person who should have helped them, the person their mother had trusted and served for so many years. As part of the legal proceedings following Alex's conviction, arrangements were made to compensate some of the victims from the sale of Alex's assets. The Moselle property where Maggie and Paul had been murdered was put up for sale. The once beautiful hunting estate, with its 1,700 acres of fields and forests, had become infamous, a place forever associated with violence and tragedy. Eventually, it sold to a buyer who planned to use it for timber and farming. Though the price was significantly lower than it might have been without the property's dark history. The Murdaugh family's other assets were also liquidated. The house in Hampton was sold. Vehicles, boats, and other personal property were auctioned off. The proceeds went toward compensating victims, though the amounts recovered fell far short of what had been stolen. Many victims would never be made whole, would never recover the full amount they had lost. The financial damage Alex had inflicted would affect these families for generations, but the impact of Alex's crimes extended beyond the direct victims of his thefts. The entire community of Hampton County and the surrounding Low Country region had been affected. The Murdaugh name had been a source of pride for many people, a symbol of the area's legal heritage and its connection to the justice system. Generations of people had grown up hearing stories about the Murdaughs, about their courtroom victories, their dedication to their clients, their importance to the community. Now that legacy was irreparably tarnished. The Murdaugh name had become synonymous with corruption, betrayal, and murder. The family's century-long dynasty had ended not in honor but in disgrace. The law firm that had borne the Murdaugh PMP changed its name entirely, trying to distance itself from the scandal and rebuild its reputation. The courthouse where Randolph Murdaughs had prosecuted cases for 87 consecutive years now stood as a reminder of how power and privilege could corrupt absolutely when left unchecked. The legal proceedings continued even after Alex's murder conviction. He faced multiple trials on the financial crime charges, and prosecutors showed no mercy. They pursued convictions on every count they could prove, wanting to ensure that even if Alex somehow succeeded in overturning his murder conviction on appeal, he would still spend the rest of his life in prison for his theft and fraud. In November 2023, Alex pleaded guilty to 22 federal charges including wire fraud, bank fraud, and money laundering. The federal plea was part of a deal that would ensure he received a 27-year sentence on top of his state murder conviction. Alex stood in federal court and admitted to the crimes he had committed, acknowledging that he had stolen from clients, defrauded his law firm, and engaged in elaborate schemes to hide his theft and maintain his lifestyle. The federal judge who sentenced Alex echoed many of the same themes that Judge Newman had expressed at the murder trial sentencing. She spoke about betrayal of trust, about the privilege Alex had enjoyed and misused, about the victims whose lives had been permanently damaged by his greed and deception. She noted that Alex had stood before her and admitted his crimes, but she questioned whether he truly understood the harm he had caused or felt genuine remorse. Alex also faced state charges for the financial crimes, and in May 2024, he pleaded guilty to an additional 19 state charges related to his theft from clients and the law firm. At this sentencing hearing, Alex was given the opportunity to speak, and he offered an apology to his victims. He said he was sorry for the pain he had caused, that he took full responsibility for his actions, and that he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand how he had become the person who committed these terrible acts. but many of the victims who were present in the courtroom that day found his apology hollow and self-serving. They noted that Alex had only apologized after being caught, after being convicted, after having no other options. They pointed out that he had lied to them for years, had looked them in the eye and deceived them repeatedly, and that his current expressions of remorse seemed designed to generate sympathy rather than reflect genuine understanding of the harm he had caused. The state judge sentenced Alex to an additional 40 years in prison for the financial crimes, combined with his 2 life sentences for murder and his federal sentence. Alex Murdaugh would die in prison multiple times over if such a thing were possible. The message from the justice system was clear and unambiguous. Alex Murdaugh's crimes had been so extensive, so harmful, and so cruel that no punishment short of ensuring he never experienced freedom again would be appropriate. Throughout all of these legal proceedings, Alex maintained his innocence regarding the murders of Maggie and Paul. Even as he pleaded guilty to the financial crimes, even as he admitted to decades of theft and fraud, he continued to insist that he had not killed his wife and son. His attorneys filed appeals of the murder conviction, arguing that errors had been made during the trial, that evidence had been improperly admitted, and that their client deserved a new trial. The appeals focused on several issues. One was the admission of evidence about Alex's financial crimes during the murder trial. The defense argued that this evidence had been prejudicial, that it had turned the jury against Alex by showing him to be a terrible person, even if it didn't directly prove he was a murderer. They contended that the financial evidence should have been excluded or at least limited, and that its admission had violated Alex's right to a fair trial. Another issue raised on appeal was the testimony about Alex's alleged motive for the murders. The defense argued that the prosecution's theory, that Alex killed Maggie and Paul to buy time and sympathy, was speculative and unsupported by direct evidence. They noted that the murders had occurred just hours after Alex's confrontation with his law partners, and they argued that there wasn't enough time for Alex to have planned and executed such a complex crime in response to that confrontation. The defense also challenged the gunshot residue evidence, arguing that the testing methods used were not reliable enough to conclusively prove that Alex had fired a weapon. They brought in experts who questioned the interpretation of the residue findings and suggested that the particles could have been transferred to Alex's clothing in other ways. But perhaps the most significant issue raised on appeal was the question of whether the jury had been improperly influenced by the intense media coverage of the case. The trial had been one of the most publicized criminal proceedings in South Carolina history. It had been live-streamed, with millions of people watching the testimony in real time. News outlets had covered every detail, legal analysts had dissected every piece of evidence, and social media had been filled with commentary about Alex's guilt or innocence. The defense argued that it had been impossible to find jurors who hadn't been exposed to pretrial publicity about the case, and that the constant media attention during the trial had created an atmosphere where the jury felt pressure to convict. They noted that the jury had deliberated for less than 3 hours, an unusually short time for a complex murder case, and suggested that this indicated the jury had been influenced by out factors rather than carefully weighing the evidence. The appeals process would take years to work through the court system. The South Carolina Supreme Court would have to review the trial court's decisions, determine whether any errors had been made, and decide whether those errors were significant enough to warrant a new trial. Legal experts who followed the case generally believed that the appeals had little chance of success. The evidence against Alex had been substantial, the trial had been conducted fairly, and the verdict had been supported by the facts. But the appeals process had to run its course, and until it did, a small measure of uncertainty remained. While the legal proceedings continued, investigators also revisited other deaths connected to the Murdaugh family, trying to determine if there were additional crimes that had been overlooked or covered up. The death of Gloria Satterlee was re-examined in detail. Her original death certificate had listed the manner of death as natural, which had never made sense given that she had fallen and suffered head trauma. The death certificate was eventually amended to list the manner of death as pending, acknowledging that there were unanswered questions about what had actually happened to Gloria. Investigators interviewed people who had been at the Murdaugh home around the time of Gloria's fall. They reviewed medical records and autopsy findings. They tried to piece together exactly what had occurred on that February day in 2018, when Gloria had fallen down the steps at the Murdaugh house. But the passage of time and the lack of a thorough initial investigation made it difficult to determine the truth. Gloria's body had been cremated, so further forensic examination was impossible. Witnesses' memories had faded, and any physical evidence from the scene had long since disappeared. Some people suspected that Gloria's fall might not have been an accident at all. That perhaps she had witnessed something she shouldn't have, or had discovered something about Alex's crimes, and had been pushed or attacked. But there was no evidence to support this theory, just suspicion and the recognition that Alex had certainly benefited from Gloria's death through the theft of her settlement. In the absence of proof, the question of what really happened to Gloria Satterfield remained unresolved, another tragedy in the long list of pain and suffering connected to the Murdaugh family. The death of Stephen Smith was also re-investigated with renewed intensity. Stephen's body had been found on Sandy Run Road in Hampton County in July 2015. He had been a nursing student at Orangeburg, Calhoun Technical College, a smart and ambitious young man with dreams of building a better life for himself. When his body was discovered in the middle of the road in the early morning hours, investigators initially suspected a hit-and-run accident. But the evidence didn't support that conclusion. Stephen's injuries weren't consistent with being struck by a vehicle. There was minimal damage to his body, no broken bones beyond his skull fracture, no road rash or tire marks on his clothing. His shoes were still on his feet and weren't scuffed in the way they would have been if he had been dragged by a car. The South Carolina Highway Patrol investigated the case as a hit and run, but their own reports contained notes questioning whether that was really what had happened. Stephen's mother, Sandy Smith, had never believed the hit and run explanation. She had fought for years to get the case reopened, to get investigators to look more closely at what had really happened to her son. She believed Stephen had been murdered, and she believed it had been covered up because powerful people were involved. Rumors had circulated for years that Stephen had been romantically involved with someone from a prominent local family, and that this relationship had led to his death. Some people whispered that Stephen had been killed because of who was dating, that his death had been a hate crime motivated by homophobia, and that the investigation had been suppressed to protect the family involved. The Murdaugh name came up in these whispers, though there was no direct evidence linking any member of the family to Stephen's death. When the Murdaugh murder case exploded into national headlines in 2021, renewed attention focused on Stephen Smith's death. SLED officially reopened the investigation, assigning fresh investigators to review the evidence and pursue new leads. They examined Stephen's body, which had been exhumed for a second autopsy. They interviewed witnesses who hadn't been questioned thoroughly the first time around. They looked at phone records, social media accounts, and any other evidence that might shed light on what had happened that night. The investigation was ongoing as of 2024, with SLUD indicating that they were actively pursuing leads but declining to provide details about specific suspects or theories. Sandy Smith expressed hope that she might finally get answers about her son's death, that the truth might finally come out after nearly a decade of questions and suspicion. Whether the investigation would ultimately lead to charges against anyone remained to be seen, but the mere fact that it was being taken seriously was a victory for Sandy, and for everyone who had believed that Stephen deserved better than to have his death dismissed as a random accident. The boat crash that killed Mallory Beach also received renewed scrutiny. Investigators looked into whether the original investigation had been compromised by the Murdaugh family's influence. They examined whether evidence had been tampered with, whether witnesses had been pressured to change their stories, and whether law enforcement officials had given Paul preferential treatment because of his family name. What they found was troubling. There was evidence that Alex Murdaugh had tried to manipulate the investigation from the very beginning. Witnesses reported that Ox had been at the hospital on the night of the crash, talking to the young people involved, seemingly trying to control what they would tell investigators. There were reports that Alex had made phone calls to people in positions of power, that he had tried to use his connections to influence how the case was handled. Connor Cook, one of the passengers on the boat that night, came forward with allegations that he had been pressured to take the blame for the crash instead of Paul. Connor claimed that in the chaotic aftermath of the accident, there had been discussions among the passengers about what to say to law enforcement, and that there had been an effort to protect Paul by suggesting that Connor had been driving. Connor said he had resisted this pressure, but that it had been intense and had come from multiple directions. The Beach family had already filed a civil lawsuit against the Murdaughs, and the revelations about Alex's crimes and his conviction for murder only strengthened their case. They pursued the lawsuit aggressively, seeking compensation not just for Mallory's death, but also for the alleged cover-up and obstruction of justice that had occurred in the aftermath of the boat crash. The lawsuit sought damages from Alex's estate, from the convenience store that had allegedly sold alcohol to underage Paul before the boat trip, and from others who might have contributed to the tragedy. As the various legal proceedings unfolded, a clearer picture emerged of what life had been like for the Murdaugh family in the years leading up to the murders. Maggie had apparently been at least partially aware of their financial problems, though the full extent of Alex's theft and fraud had likely been hidden from her. Friends reported that Maggie had seemed stressed and worried in the months before her death, that she had made comments about money being tight and about concerns regarding legal bills from Paul's boat crash case. Some evidence suggested that Maggie and Alex's marriage had been under strain. There were indications that they had been spending more time apart, that Maggie had been staying at their beach house more frequently, and that there had been tension between them. Whether this strain was related to Maggie discovering or suspecting Alex's crimes was unclear, but it added another layer to the prosecution's theory that Alex might have seen Maggie as a threat, someone who might expose him or leave him at the worst possible time. Paul's life in the months before his death had been dominated by the impending trial for the boat crash. He had been vilified in the media and on social media, with people calling him a murderer and demanding that he be held accountable for Mallory Beach's death. The pressure had clearly affected him. Friends reported that Paul had been drinking more heavily, that he had been anxious and depressed, and that he had struggled with the weight of knowing that his actions had caused someone's death. Yet Paul had also shown signs of trying to do better. He had been in counseling, had talked about wanting to change his relationship with alcohol, and had expressed remorse for what had happened to Mallory. Some of his friends believed that he would have eventually taken responsibility for his actions and tried to make amends as best he could. But he never got that chance. His life was cut short at 22, murdered by his own father if the jury's verdict was to be believed, and his potential for growth and redemption was lost forever. Buster Murdaugh, the surviving son, faced the impossible task of trying to rebuild his life in the aftermath of unimaginable tragedy and scandal. He had lost his mother and brother to violence, his father to conviction for their murders, and his family's reputation to decades of fraud and corruption. Buster maintained his belief in his father's innocence regarding the murders, standing by Alex even as the evidence against him mounted and the convictions accumulated. Buster testified at some of the hearings, speaking about his father's character and his family's life before everything fell apart. He described happy memories, family traditions, moments of love and connection that seemed impossible to reconcile with the portrait of Alex as a cold-blooded killer. But Buster's loyalty to his father, while understandable from a son's perspective, also raised questions about what he had known and when he had known it. Had Buster been aware of his father's financial crimes? Had he suspected anything about the murders? Or had he been kept in the dark, another victim of Alex's elaborate web of lies? The community of Hampton County struggled to process everything that had happened. The Murdaugh family had been such a dominant presence for so long that their fall created a vacuum, a sense of disorientation and loss even among those who had been harmed by them. The courthouse where generations of Murdaughs had practiced law now stood as a monument to both their accomplishments and their crimes. The streets where they had walked, the churches where they had worshipped, the restaurants where they had eaten, all of these familiar places were now imbued with new and darker meanings. Some people in the community expressed relief that the truth had finally come out, that the Murdaughs' crimes had been exposed and punished. They felt that justice had been served, that the system had ultimately worked even if it had taken far too long. Others mourned the loss of the Murdaugh legacy, remembering the good that the family had done over the years, even while acknowledging the terrible harm they had caused. The story of the Murdaugh family murders stands as one of the most shocking criminal cases in modern American history, a tale that encompasses everything from a century-long legal dynasty to financial fraud, drug addiction, and ultimately the unthinkable act of a father murdering his own wife and son. The case revealed how power and privilege, when unchecked and corrupted, can lead to destruction on a scale that affects not just individuals but entire communities. Alex Murdaugh now sits in a South Carolina prison, serving 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders of Maggie and Paul, along with decades more for his financial crimes. He has been stripped of his law license, his assets, his freedom, and his reputation. The man who once walked through Hampton County as if he owned it, whose name commanded respect and opened doors, is now known primarily as a killer and a thief. The victims of his crimes continue to deal with the aftermath. The families who trusted Alex to handle their legal cases and were robbed in return struggle with financial hardship and betrayal. Gloria Satterfield's sons finally received some compensation, though nothing can truly make up for the theft of millions of dollars that should have been theirs or for the loss of their mother under circumstances that remain not fully explained. The Beach family continues to grieve for Mallory, their loss compounded by the knowledge that the young man responsible for her death was himself murdered before he could face full accountability. The Low Country region of South Carolina has been forever changed by the Murdaugh scandal. The legal system that the family dominated for so long has been forced to examine how one family was able to wield so much unchecked power for so many generations. Questions have been raised about conflicts of interest, about the dangers of allowing one family to hold the same position of authority for nearly a century, and about the need for greater oversight and accountability in the justice system. The case has also become a cultural phenomenon, the subject of countless documentaries, podcasts, books, and news articles. People across the country and around the world have followed the twists and turns of the story, fascinated by the dramatic fall of a powerful family, and the gothic horror of a father murdering his own family to protect his secrets. Yet beneath all the sensationalism and media coverage, the case is ultimately about 2 people who should still be alive, Maggie and Paul Murdaugh. Whatever their flaws, whatever mistakes they made, they did not deserve to die in a burst of violence on a June evening, at a place that should have been their sanctuary. They were victims of a man who valued his own image and freedom more than he valued their lives. A man who made the coldest of calculations and pulled the trigger without mercy. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this case, leave a comment and subscribe. Good night and stay safe.